Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Maria David. I'm the Interim Director of the Abu Suleiman Center for Global Islamic Studies, and a faculty member and longtime colleague of Dr. Abdulaziz Sachedina, our esteemed speaker today. And I'm going to introduce him to you in a minute. But before, first of all, I want to ask you all to stay after the talk and join us for a reception with some refreshments as well. And I also want to tell you about some of our upcoming events. So on Monday, March 27th, we'll be hosting a talk and an iftar. The talk will be with Professor Oludamini Oguneka from University of Virginia, who will talk about the West African tradition of praise poetry on the Prophet Muhammad. And then on March 29th, we will virtually host Miriam Paula Davis, who will talk about markets of civilization, Islam, and racial capitalism. So there's flyers, at least for some of those events and for some later events in the semester as well, so please feel free to take those. And I would just point out in the flyer for today, there's a QR code in the corner. If you use that QR code, it will take you to where you can purchase a copy of Professor Sachedina's book. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Abdulaziz Sachedina, who is professor and IIIT Chair of Islamic Studies here at Mason. He has studied and still teaches all over the world, but his PhD is from the University of Toronto. His research has focused on Islamic law, ethics, and theology for at least 2 decades, and most recently, he's focused on social and political ethics, interfaith and intrafaith relations, human rights, and Islamic biomedical ethics. He is the author of many books, including Islamic Messianism, The Just Ruler in Shiite Islam, Islamic Roots of Democratic Pluralism, Islamic Biomedical Ethics, Islam and the Challenge of Human Rights, and that's just some of his previously published books. But today, we're happy to have him talk to us about his most recent book, Islamic Ethics, Fundamental Aspects of Human Conduct. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak about my recent publication. And I think, although Maria has told me it's about half an hour or 45 minutes, if I begin to talk about the book, it will take 2 or 3 hours. I don't know. I'm going to really try to sum up 2 or 3 things that has happened. Writing about a subject that you are working on for many, many years is a challenge, because you already have a set mind, on certain things that you say about your subject. And for me, there are 2 challenges working at the same time. One is that I'm looking at the Muslim scripture as an outsider at one level, but then also I am part of that culture and part of that community that believes in it. So for me to work on a topic like this is to question myself, that I hope I'm not entering the research with prefabricated ideas. And because that happens if you grow up in a tradition for a long time, then you do adopt certain things and they become unconsciously part of you. And you keep on reminding yourself that you can't do this. This is not acceptable. Academic challenge is very different when you deal with something like the Quran. And I say this because my entire work is driven by a challenge that I felt. And that was for me to think about that Orientalist scholarship took up the study of Islam and Islamic scriptures, Islamic culture, Islamic literature, everything dealing with Islam, but they always ruled out Islamic ethics as being something native to the Quran. Their idea was that Hellenism played a big role in informing the ethics of the Muslims. In other words, it was the period of translation in 9th, 10th century from Greek into Arabic that spurred interest in the American ethics. And the whole idea about virtue ethics. Now, there was also recognition by the legal scholars on Islam that there are already concepts that are talking about the good and bad, they are talking about good and evil, within the Quran, within the theology, but doesn't play as much a role as the formal kind of reasoning that is part of the legal reasoning. Here there is a lot of interaction between Jewish scholarship on the halakha and the Iraqi scholarship on the law of Islamic law. There is a lot of things are happening about which we know very little. How Sephardi Jewish law informed Muslim scholars. And what was their relationship? Abu Hanifa was in Baghdad, and so there were Jewish scholars in Baghdad. Oh, you know, this was the Babylonian period that they had preserved. So there was a lot of conversation going on about which we know very little, by the way. Nobody has tried to unfold that area of the study. So my work was, in a way, to re-enter Orientalist mind and try to think that why was it that the Quran was not made any central document in the study of the culture itself? Why was it that they had to go, Ibn Abdul they had to go to the literary works where they could explore the culture? But the Quran for them was not something that was divinely ordained. The scholarship was very clear that the Quran was, something that Muhammad created. And, that's how he told the people. And the fact was that the Quran was not a written book at that point. It was an oral, message that was coming to the people. The Quran and Muhammad were identical because the Quran was not a separate entity from Muhammad. My whole challenge began with the notion that I have to locate ethics somewhere, not in the Aristotelian heritage that we had. There were so many works written on ethics by the Muslim philosophers, and they were writing it from the very clear, understanding of Nicomachean ethics, and trying to see how virtue ethics could become the fundamental foundation of Islamic, moral thinking. In other words, I was shifting from virtue ethics to juridical ethics in my search for where exactly can I locate the Quranic ethics. I was pretty sure that the Quran had a very clear understanding of the human purpose, and the Quran was quite clearly using terminology that was not commonly used and preserved by the later generations in part of what we call philosophical or ethical studies. Akhlaq was known as a terminology term that was used to speak about moral behavior, or it was part of the etiquette, other literature. But what I find to be interesting is that the Quran introduces itself, I'm talking about the ideas. There was no book, the way you and I think. In the early period, there was the message. And the Quran was talking about a very important term, tazakki. Tazakki was one of the ideas that the Quran was using for moral excellence. In fact, Montgomery Ward, in his book on Muhammad and Mecca, argues quite clearly, I think he's right from all the sources that I've examined, that Islam was not Islam in the early days, it was the religion of tazakki. That means it was a religion that was geared towards, improvement of human moral performance. It's quite interesting to see that zakah, zakayya, zakayya, even the word zakat itself, the charity that you do, that also is connected with some kind of idea of moral purification. Because the more you spend in the path of God, the more you purify, and the more your earnings become, increased. That's the idea. The search for me was to locate ethics in the Quran, but I was not able to see any formal ideas in the Quran. In the teachings of the Quran, ethics were there as part of the human behavior. Okay, you are supposed to be truthful. You are supposed to be just. You are supposed to be compassionate. All these ideas were ethical ideas, but they were not systematically presented in the Quran. They were presented as part of the human obligation. Human obligation was to become universal for the Quran. The Quran is aware of the religious differences and the diversity in the Meccan situation. There are Christian churches, there are Christian groups, Jewish communities, Zoroastrians. In Meccan landscape, you find diversity of cultures and religions. Ebionites, Jacobites, Eastern churches were all everywhere in Arabia at that point. And there was a lot of influence of these in the hermeneutics of the Quran later on, as much as in the development of the hermeneutic tradition, how the text was to be studied, how the text was to be interpreted. And I found, sources that speak about that early period. My puzzle was, if the Quran had that message, where did it end up? Where did it go? We are told there is no ethics in Islam. Orientalists were very clear that ethics really begins with Hellenism. Hellenistic tradition, when it's translated into Arabic, now we have Nicomachean ethics, and it is being commented upon by the Muslims. So they learned that ethics, and they started talking about it. And it left the impression, even now, in the seminarian curriculum, you find Aristotelian ethics being taught. Yes, virtue ethics. So you talk about fadail, you talk about the merits, radail, you talk about, the bad habits. All of these things are part of that. So when you look at Ibn Miskawayh, the one who's writing about how to develop what we call the inner self, to reflect the divine qualities, he's talking about that kind of virtuous life that Aristotle talks about. Aristotle says quite clearly that virtues must be personified. That's the way you learn them. That's the way you become firm in your virtuous life. So that was that heritage that Muslims did have. Nasirian ethics, Dawani, so many others who wrote major works of ethics. They were simply following the Hellenistic ethics fundamentally and giving it an Islamic coloring. They started bringing it together with citation from the scriptures, from what the Prophet had taught. So Sunnah and the Quran were being, cited by them, but without any attempt to look at the Quran as the source of ethics. So there are certain things that I take in meditation, I get right. So let's look at the way this book is projected. One area of the book is determined to find sources which are trying to build community of the believers as much as the community's relationship to other communities. So two things are going on. There's a recognition in the Quran about plurality of human faiths. It does make it quite clear that different communities have their own rituals, their own legal systems, and the Quran is pretty clear about it. Even the last chapter that chronologically was the last chapter, Al-Ma'idah, there's clearly, the verses of the Quran are saying, all of you have, each one of you have your own rituals, your own books, your own Shari'a, so to speak. And we know that you will not agree with one another, and you will not become one, but in the meantime, we want you to live in peace, in harmony. Then the Quran gives the prescription. Fastabaqul khairat. Go, compete in doing good. That's the only way communities can live together. Because your theologies will not agree with one another. You will not agree with one another, but we need something to make peace among you. What shall we teach you? Fastabaqul khairat. Go and do compete in doing good. Khairat is the general term for, moral, righteous action. So the Quran has a very clear understanding that when a new religion comes, people will not abide by it. There will be those who will always remain outside, and they will oppose this new community. In the meantime, we need to find ways of coexisting, cooperation between peoples. And the Quran introduces ethical language for that. Wa'adilu waqsidu. These are the two terms that appear in the Quran several times, that we want you to treat one another fairly. There has to be fairness in the way you treat one another. And the other thing that we want you to do is that you need to be just. You need to practice justice in the way, whether it is distributive justice, all kinds of understanding about what are the rights of others on you. That language is the Quranic language. The Quran uses that language in order to make it clear that human beings will not agree, will never have a common theology to combine one another. It's difficult for them to build a common theology. To say, okay, we have one common theology among all religions. No, you will not do it, because each community wants to say that I have the path. I will show you the path. I'll save you. If you follow my way, you will be saved. So salvation is very much controlled in exclusionary terms. There should be only one, tradition that guarantees, that kind of salvation. But the Quran came with the idea that, well, true, every community has a right to claim about its own salvation history and salvation validity. But let's face it, there are different religions, many religions, and they will have to have a common ground between them. And that common ground will be the ethical ground. Now what then my work is now beginning to do the research in several types of sources, by the way, not only Quranic exegesis, but also studying the legal methodology. How did the Muslims make a decision about certain things when they wanted to bring about, they show the transformation of the society. The society was changing. It was, they were conquering different places. The Arabs were going everywhere, and therefore there was an interaction between different civilizations and different cultures. And how exactly were they going to, influence one another? And I think the idea was that in all this chaotic aspect of the change and transformation, we need one stable universal source of allowing human conversation to take place. And this is what I find in the sources. The sources, when I push them enough, they take me to the usul al-fiqh. They take me to the legal theory. In legal theory, I find out that no decision is made without any reference to morality, although it's never articulated. So the rule that came, quite in the early period when the community was still in Medina, I would say that jurisprudence was moving much faster than any other tradition, because there was a need to become a society, a political society that is tolerant enough, that is able to live with one another. That's the idea that Islam put forward, that no, you will not be able to live in isolation. You have to live with others. In order for you to live with others, you will need to find sources for doing that. You need to find opinions that support that. What I find to be quite interesting is that the early theory of legal decision making was so quick to respond to the needs that the question about good and evil, husn wa qabh, they do come up quite often in the discussions, but not in the theory. In usul al-fiqh, there was no idea, there was no reference to, because this is good, therefore you should do it. But I found quite interesting in Kitab al-Tijara, in the book that deals with merchants, with, writing contracts. In that book, there was an idea, for example, you would say, al-ghash, means to cheat someone, to mix sugar with sand, and cheat people and sell it. And they said, hada qabih. Didn't say halal or haram. This is bad, you should not be doing it. In other words, the terms that are being used to imply the prohibition is the same term that is found to be in ethics. The qabih, this is not good, you should not be doing this, is evil. The language appears quite interestingly connected with the idea in the mind of the jurist. I'm now trying to read the mind of the jurist. Where exactly does he work on ethics? Imagine, Muslims are told that if you have not paid rent of your apartment, you can't pray in that apartment. Your prayers are not involved. Basic duty of paying your rent. If the water doesn't belong to you, if you've not paid your water or electricity bills, you can't pray in that light, or you can't use that water to perform ablutions, because it doesn't belong to you. You haven't paid for it. That language, by the way, is the ethical language. It's not good when you claim something to be yours, which is not legally yours, which is not morally yours. So it's a very interesting way of saying that you cannot pray. This is connected with the ritual. You cannot pray in this place because you have not paid the rent. Or, let's say you're traveling in the airport, and the airport is a private airport. You can't pray in that airport. You need to take the permission of the owner. Taking the permission of the owner is your duty. What kind of duty is it? It is what we call plainly a moral obligation. They might laugh at you. They might say, well, you can pray anywhere you want, We won't stop you. Let's say on New York airport, and nobody stops you if you want to do that. But there are places where you become extremely careful. So what I'm trying to show here is that jurisprudence is closely aligned with ethics, and yet it does not present ethical theories. It doesn't do it. You don't find those ethical discussions there. You find them in philosophical theology, in Kalam. You find these discussions in the Hadith literature. Sometimes you see them in the collection of the Fatawa. That means the opinion they are given. So all kinds of sources, you are mustering those in order for you to prove one thing. That's what I did. That there is something going on in usul al-fiqh, in the legal theory, that is actually using ethical categories to explain why we should be doing certain things, why we should be avoiding doing certain things. In other words, the two words in legal writings, jawaz, permission, is equal to moral, being morally right. Or tahreem, haram, means it is immoral, you should not be doing it. They are using legal terms, but what they mean is that this is something that is ethics is requiring. So what is lacking here is that there is no discussion of the ethics at all. What I found also in the modern times, many jurists in the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, whose works I know more, intimately, they make it quite clear that ethics has nothing to do with Shari'a. But they say, there is Ayatollah who says, ethics you don't discuss with fiqh, you don't discuss with jurisprudence. Quite to the contrary, what I'm seeing in the sources is that there is an indirect reference to the sources being ethically aware and ethically very conscious. Look at one example that I found. And I found that, and I've used it in this, what we call applied ethics. Because this book deals with the applied ethics, whereas instead of moving from theory to the application, I did first application and then the theory. And the theory shows very clearly that there is one rule: no harm should be done to anyone. No harm, no harassment. This is something given, la darar wa la dirar. You should not harm anyone, you should not reciprocate harm with harm. Now, that's an ethical principle. And yet it has become legal source for so many decisions in the modern times. Because what I'm searching for is, what is the modern application? Why is it that we are still talking about, issues that we thought that they were solved 50 years ago. And we still are talking about it. If you go to Iran, you go to Iraq, you find those issues have come up again. And they've come up again because ethics has been put aside. Because all the decision making is based on textual hermeneutics. Textuality is good up to a certain level, but what you need is to push rationality to make the textual resources more meaningful. There is suspicion of reasoning, by the way. All over in the fiqh, in the jurisprudence, reasoning is not trusted. Ijtihad al-aqli is not trusted. Ijtihad al-naqli is trusted. That means the independent thinking based on human rationality is suspicious. Because our rationality is conditioned by our social conditions, it is structured by it, and therefore we are not using it the way it should be used. So what we have done is that, yes, reasoning is divine gift, but we have removed it from its metaphysical foundation. Therefore, it is not as reliable as it should have been. But how about text? The text also is very much dependent upon the way we read it. If I don't understand the text the way it should be read, then I'll come to different conclusions, and perhaps even faulty conclusions. And this has been the argument today, that should women cover their head? It's a very interesting and a very burning question today in the modern times. And this is where, Iranian women are, crying out for their rights. And, that those rights, I think it's true, because the whole question, arises with duties of two kinds. Look at the way the legal theory is telling us. Legal theory is saying that there are certain duties that you just obey. You don't question those. And those are what we call in Arabic mawlavi hukme, mawlavi. It is an injunction that must be obeyed. You don't ask why. Why should I obey it? This is what we call, in the Sunni Islam, we call it what we call the divine command ethics. Divine command ethics, you're supposed to obey. Don't ask why and how. You just obey, and you are preparing yourself for the next war. But in other areas, this is a very important issue, because wearing hijab or keeping a beard for men, all of these things require preparation of the culture. The culture should be ready to tell you that. And when overnight the rulers ask women to remove the hijab, overnight they tell them you have to wear them, there is no time to prepare the culture. So the culture is never ready to converse with those who will be impacted by it. And therefore we have a problem. We have a problem in the Muslim world at the moment. We don't know how exactly should they, be following it. And what is it that they should be doing it? Now, look at the way ethics and law are intertwined. In other words, today, in biomedical ethics, when you're asking for practical, applied ethical decisions, where do you go? You go to the jurists in Al-Azhar or some other places, and they give you fatwa, they give you a legal decision. Is it only legal or is it also ethical? What I argue in my book is that they are both. What is not being accepted as ethics is because of the fear that it is not totally dependent upon revelation. It is dependent upon reason. Rationality is demanded in ethics. In ethics, everyone has a right to decide what is right and what is wrong, because it is given to all human beings as a gift from God, the knowledge of good and evil. فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. All human beings have been inspired with the knowledge of good and evil. Therefore, they know how to make a decision. If they have not heard the revelation at any time, they can still be held accountable for what has been implanted, infused in them. So I use a main idea, my main theoretical aspect of the book is dealing with fitra, the infused morality. Where does infused morality start from? It starts from the birth, because it does say, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا. The moment we create a human being, the first thing we give the human being is the ability to know the right from the wrong. So there's no excuse. I can make excuse of not following in religion, but I cannot make an excuse for not following any moral principles, because it is implanted in me, it is innate to me. That innate aspect gives me the chance to say that means there's also political theology as much as juridical theology. In political theology, I find that equality of human beings. So in my book on Islam and the challenge of human rights, that's where I present this whole idea, that there is given secularity in Islam. This is something controversial. The moment you bring secularity and religion, it becomes controversial. But it is true. Not having a church, and I hope not having clerical authority in power, we can have an independent individuals reacting to the divine, science. In other words, what the Quran is quite clear is that if you want to examine, if you want to check on the health of the society, check the individual. You need the individual to tell you what kind of spirituality, what kind of morality are they influenced with. Communities might not reflect it because they are not capable of talking to the, conscience in a collective way. Each conscience functions independently. To finally come to the conclusion of my book, no research is complete without controversy, right? We cherish controversies. And this book also is already translated in Iran at the moment. It's just waiting the permission from the Ministry of Religious Guidance to be allowed to be published. But everything, all the books have been published. But I found that in Persian translation, the translation was distorted. It was made to conform with the government policy. So if I criticize Iran's performance in human rights, they removed it, or something that the clerical authorities do, they also remove that. In other words, when the translations, but to my pleasant surprise, in Iraq, when they translated in Arabic, everything was preserved. They were not afraid. But in Iran, there was this fear that, this will cause another problem for the society. You will mislead them. In other words, what we are, experiencing today is, there's a call for reform, but we don't know exactly where the reform should begin. And actually what I'm suggesting in the book is that it is the interpretive jurisprudence which is the main springboard for the ethical values and ethical performance assessment. This is where you find that it is possible for us to do that without, causing more damage to the reform program that are going on. Thank you very much. Thank you.